The stagecoach wheel struck a deep rut in the hardened earth, sending a violent shudder through the wooden carriage and jarring Clara Vance from a fitful, shallow sleep. She did not gasp or cry out. She simply adjusted her posture, straightening her spine against the rigid leather seat, and brushed a thin layer of pale yellow dust from the dark wool of her morning dress. The air inside the coach was suffocating, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, oiled leather, and the endless baking heat of the late summer plains. Across from her, a travelling salesman snored softly, his chin resting on his chest, oblivious to the punishing landscape rolling past the window. Clara looked out at the sprawling expanse of dry grass and scattered, twisted scrub oaks. This was the frontier, a place that promised nothing and demanded everything. She had not wanted to come to the town of Oakhaven, but her husband's sudden death from a fever 3 weeks prior had left her with no other choice. Thomas had spoken of a plot of land he had purchased here, a sweeping acreage that was meant to be their new beginning after his business in the East had failed. Now it was her only inheritance, the sole remaining anchor in a world that had suddenly and violently cut her adrift. When the coach finally groaned to a halt before the Oakhaven Mercantile, the sun was sitting heavy and red on the western horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the dusty thoroughfare. Clara stepped down onto the boardwalk, her heavy leather boots sinking slightly into the soft, warped wood. The town was a collection of rough-hewn buildings with false fronts that looked like desperate attempts at civilization in a place that actively resisted it. She carried a single woven valise, the sum total of her worldly possessions, and a leather folio containing the deed to the land Thomas had promised her. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back into a severe, practical knot, gave away nothing of the exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. She was a woman who had learned early in life that displaying vulnerability was an invitation to predators. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, and walked deliberately toward the town's only bank, a brick building that exuded a false sense of permanence. The interior of the bank was cool, smelling of ink, polished brass, and the stale sweat of anxious men. Behind the iron teller's cage stood Silas Merrick, a man whose reputation as a pillar of the community was matched only by his girth and the cold, flat calculation in his pale eyes. He was the banker, the owner of the general store, and the silent partner in half the ranches in the valley. Clara approached the counter, placing her leather folio on the polished mahogany surface. She introduced herself with quiet dignity, explaining her situation and presenting the deed Thomas had signed. Merrick picked up the paper with thick, manicured fingers, his eyes scanning the document before a slow, pitying smile spread across his fleshy face. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes, a smile that Clara immediately recognized as the prelude to a terrible violence, though not of the physical kind. Merrick folded the deed carefully and slid it back across the counter. He spoke in a voice that was smooth and overly loud, designed to ensure that the 2 other patrons in the bank could hear every word of her impending humiliation. He informed her, with a tone of rehearsed regret, that her late husband had indeed purchased the land, but he had done so on credit, borrowing heavily against the deed itself to finance a herd of cattle that had never materialized. The note, Merrick explained, had come due 2 days after Thomas's death. Since no payment had been made, the bank had foreclosed on the property that very morning. Clara stood perfectly still, the words washing over her like freezing water. She asked to see the ledger, her voice steady, refusing to let the tremor in her hands reach her throat. Merrick sighed, a heavy, patronizing sound, and turned the massive, leather-bound book toward her, tapping a thick finger against a column of numbers. The ink was fresh, the numbers devastatingly clear. The debt was enormous, completely insurmountable for a widow with a single valise and $3 silver in her coin purse. Clara did not argue. She recognized the intricate, impenetrable wall of legal theft when she saw it. She closed the folio, tucked it under her arm, and walked out of the bank into the fading light. The heat of the day was breaking, replaced by a dry, sweeping wind that kicked up dust devils in the street. She needed a room, and she needed work. Over the next 2 days, Clara visited every establishment in Oakhaven, She offered her services as a seamstress, a cook, a bookkeeper, and a laundress. She was educated, highly literate, and possessed a mind for mathematics that had often surprised her late husband. But at every turn she was met with closed doors and averted eyes. The boarding-house proprietress, a usually fair-minded woman named Martha Higgins, had looked at Clara with genuine sorrow before whispering that Mr. Merrick had made it clear that anyone offering aid to the widow Vance would find their own credit lines severely restricted. Merrick wanted her desperate. He wanted her to leave, or worse, he wanted her to come crawling back to him to accept whatever degrading terms of survival he might offer. By the afternoon of the third day, Clara found herself sitting on a rough wooden bench outside the blacksmith's forge, the heat from the fires radiating against her back. Her stomach was a hollow, aching cavern. She had spent her last coins on a single loaf of bread and a tin of water. The town moved around her, actively ignoring her presence. Men in broad-brimmed hats and dusty coats walked past without tipping their brims. Women in faded calico dresses pulled their children closer as they crossed the street. She was a pariah, isolated by the invisible, suffocating influence of Silas Merrick. Clara looked down at her hands, the skin pale and smooth, unaccustomed to the brutal labor that would be required to survive here. Yet beneath the refined exterior, a quiet, furious resilience burned. She would not beg. She would not weep in the dust. She would sit here, maintaining her dignity until a solution presented itself, or until she collapsed. Across the street, leaning against the wooden support post of the mercantile awning, Elias Thorne watched her. Elias was a man carved from the very landscape of the frontier, tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered by years of sun and wind. His face was a map of hard miles and quiet sorrows, dominated by eyes the color of a winter sky. He was a rancher, the owner of Blackwood Ridge, a vast spread of land to the north that he ran with methodical, solitary precision. Elias rarely came into Oakhaven, preferring the silence of his land to the noise and hypocrisy of the town. He was a widower of 5 years, a man who had built high, impenetrable fences around his heart after the loss of his wife to the cholera epidemic. He was respected by the townspeople, mostly because he demanded nothing from them and owed nothing to Silas Merrick. Elias had observed the widow Vance since her arrival. He had seen the way she carried herself, her spine straight as a plumb line, despite the exhaustion that clearly weighed on her. He had watched her enter the bank, and he had seen the subtle shift in her posture when she emerged, the stiffening of resolve, the quiet acceptance of a heavy blow. Over the past 2 days he had watched from a distance as she methodically sought employment, witnessing the quiet, cowardly refusals of the townspeople. He knew Merrick's tactics well. The banker was a scavenger, a man who picked the bones of the vulnerable. Elias felt a familiar, cold anger tightening in his chest, a righteous fury that he usually kept buried beneath layers of stoic indifference. He did not like to involve himself in the affairs of others. Involvement led to attachment, and attachment led to pain. That was the rule he had lived by for 5 years. But as Elias watched Clara sitting on the bench, covered in a fine layer of dust, her chin held high despite the hunger that must have been gnawing at her, the rule broke. He saw in her a reflection of his own stubborn endurance. He pushed himself away from the wooden post, his spurs jingling softly in the quiet afternoon air, and crossed the wide, dusty street. His shadow fell over Clara before he spoke. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his pale ones. There was no fear in her gaze, only a weary, guarded intelligence. She saw a man in worn denim and a faded canvas coat, a man whose hands were calloused and scarred from years of unforgiving labor. "Nobody will hire me," Clara said, her voice dry and raspy, lacking any trace of self-pity. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered to the only person who had dared to stand near her in 3 days. "I know," Elias said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to emanate from his chest. Merrick made sure of it. Clara's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her valise. "He wields a great deal of power for a man who produces nothing." A faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touched the corners of Elias's mouth. It was a dry, ironic observation that appealed to his own sense of justice. "He produces fear," Elias corrected quietly. It is a highly profitable commodity in a town like this, but his reach does not extend to Blackwood Ridge. Elias paused, looking down at the woman. He was not a man given to charity. Charity insulted the recipient and burdened the giver. Instead, he offered a transaction. "My ledgers are a mess," he stated plainly. "I can read a trail and I can read the weather, but I have no patience for columns of numbers. My housekeeper left for California 2 months ago, and the dust in my cabin is an inch thick. I need a bookkeeper, and I need someone to manage the house. I will pay you a fair wage, provide room and board, and guarantee your safety on my land." Clara studied him carefully. She searched his face for the hidden cost, the unspoken expectation that usually accompanied such offers from solitary men. But she found nothing in Elias Thorne's eyes except a flat, practical honesty. He was not offering salvation, he was offering employment. It was an arrangement that preserved her dignity. "I am highly proficient in accounting, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice gaining a fraction of its normal strength. "And I am not afraid of hard work, but I must be clear. I am offering my labour, nothing more." "I am asking for nothing more, Mrs. Vance," Elias replied, touching the brim of his hat. "My wagon is loaded outside the mercantile. We leave in an hour." The journey to Blackwood Ridge took 3 hours, the wagon rattling over rutted trails that wound through rising foothills and dense stands of dark pine. The silence between them was profound, but it was not the strained, awkward silence of strangers forcing conversation. It was the heavy, comfortable silence of two people who understood that words were precious and not to be wasted. Clara sat on the wooden bench, watching the landscape shift from arid plains to rugged, forested highlands. The air grew cooler, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine resin and damp earth. When they finally crested the last ridge, the ranch revealed itself, a sprawling valley of rich green grass, a sturdy log cabin, a massive timber barn, and a winding creek that glinted like hammered silver in the twilight. It was a place of stark, isolated beauty. True to his word, Elias's home was a testament to solitary neglect. The cabin was structurally sound, built with thick, interlocking logs that kept out the wind, but the interior was coated in a thick layer of dust. The cast-iron stove was cold, the floorboards were unswept, and a massive oak desk in the corner was buried under a chaotic mountain of receipts, invoices, and banknotes. Elias showed her to a small private room at the back of the cabin, provided her with fresh water, and then retreated to the barn to tend to the horses, leaving her to settle in. Clara did not rest. She unpacked her single dress, washed her face, and immediately tied a rough canvas apron over her skirt. She found a broom, a bucket, and a block of lye soap. By the time Elias returned to the cabin 2 hours later, the floors were swept, the stove was burning bright and hot, and the smell of boiling coffee filled the air. Over the next 4 weeks, Clara transformed the environment of Blackwood Ridge. She moved with a quiet, relentless efficiency. She scrubbed the windows until they let in the golden morning light. She mended Elias's torn canvas coats with precise, invisible stitches. She cultivated a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin, coaxing life from the stubborn soil. But her greatest triumph was the oak desk. Every evening, by the light of a kerosene lamp, she sat before the mountain of paper, sorting, calculating, and recording. She possessed a sharp, analytical mind, and as she organized Elias's financial life, she began to see the shape of the ranch, not just in acres and cattle, but in profit and loss. Elias watched her work. He would sit by the hearth, whittling a piece of cedar or repairing a broken bridle, his eyes occasionally lifting to observe the focused intensity on her face. He noticed the way she chewed on the end of her pen when she found a discrepancy, the way she carefully blotted the ink so it would not smudge, the proud, straight line of her back. He had expected a housekeeper, he had found a partner. The high fences he had built around his life were not being torn down, but rather, Clara was quietly opening a gate he had forgotten existed. They spoke little, communicating instead through the rhythm of their shared labour. A fresh cup of coffee placed silently on his desk, a repaired saddle blanket left on the porch rail, a bucket of water hauled from the creek before she could ask. These were the quiet currencies of their growing respect. It was during the third week of her meticulous accounting that Clara found the anomaly. She was cross-referencing Elias's cattle sales from the previous autumn with the bank deposits recorded by Silas Merrick. She worked late into the night, the only sound the scratching of her steel nib pen and the occasional pop of a pine knot in the stove. She ran the numbers 3 times, her brow furrowed in concentration. The next morning, as Elias sat at the rough-hewn dining table eating a plate of eggs and biscuits she had prepared, Clara brought the heavy ledger to the table and laid it open before him. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone professional and precise, "you are being robbed." Elias stopped chewing and looked at the ledger, then up at her. "Explain." Clara pointed to a column of figures. "Last October, you sold 300 head of cattle to the Eastern Syndicate. The bill of sale from the drover lists the price at $20 a head. That is $6,000. However, the deposit receipt from Silas Merrick's bank, where the funds were wired, shows a deposit of only $5,200. Merrick recorded an $800 deduction for transit fees and holding taxes." She flipped back several pages. "I have found similar discrepancies in your grain sales and your equipment purchases over the last 4 years. In total, Merrick has siphoned nearly $3,000 from your accounts through fabricated fees and inflated interest rates on short-term notes." Elias stared at the numbers. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He was a man who understood physical threats, rustlers, and harsh winters. The abstract theft of numbers on a page was a different kind of warfare, one he had been blind to. He looked up at Clara, seeing not just a widow in need of shelter, but a woman of immense intelligence and formidable capability. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I am a bookkeeper, Mr. Thorne," Clara replied, her chin rising slightly. "Numbers do not lie. Only men do. I have compiled the evidence. It is irrefutable." Elias slowly closed the ledger. "Thank you, Clara," he said softly, using her given name for the first time. The shift in his tone was subtle, but it resonated in the quiet cabin like a struck bell. It was an acknowledgement of her worth, a recognition that she was no longer just an employee, but an integral part of Blackwood Ridge. The peace of the ranch, however, was an illusion that Silas Merrick could not abide. Rumours had trickled down into Oak Haven. The town gossips whispered that the proud, solitary Elias Thorne had taken in the destitute widow, and Merrick's fragile ego could not tolerate the defiance. To Merrick, Clara was a loose end, a woman who had refused to be broken by his power, and Elias was a man who stood outside his sphere of control. Furthermore, Merrick knew exactly what was in Elias's ledgers. If an educated woman was looking closely at those books, his long-standing embezzlement would be discovered. He needed to reassert his dominance, to remind them both that he was the master of the valley. The confrontation began on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the colour of bruised iron, heavy with the promise of a dry thunderstorm. Clara was in the yard, hanging freshly washed linens on a line stretched between 2 oak trees, when a black buggy pulled by 2 matched geldings crested the ridge. Silas Merrick sat on the leather bench, accompanied by 2 of his hired men, rough, hard-eyed individuals who served as his enforcers. Elias was in the corral, breaking a young roan. At the sight of the buggy, he tied the horse to the rail, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his canvas sleeve, and walked slowly toward the front porch. Clara dropped the damp sheet into the basket and moved to stand behind Elias, her presence a quiet, solid support. Merrick halted the buggy near the porch, refusing to step down. He looked down at them with a manufactured smile that dripped with condescension. "Afternoon, Elias," Merrick called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "I thought I should pay a visit, ensure everything is in order out here on the edge of civilization. I see you've taken on some domestic help." His eyes slid toward Clara, filled with a greasy, insinuating light. "My affairs are in order, Merrick," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of welcome. "State your business and get off my land." Merrick's smile tightened, the edges turning brittle. "Now, Elias, there's no need for hostility. I am here as a concerned citizen. The town is talking. It is highly improper. A man and a widow living out here unchaperoned. It offends the moral sensibilities of Oak Haven. Furthermore," Merrick paused, pulling a folded document from his breast pocket. I have been reviewing the bank's records. It seems there is a small discrepancy regarding the boundaries of your southern pasture, a matter of a surveying error from 10 years ago. It appears a portion of your water rights actually belongs to the bank's adjoining parcel. It was a blatant, fabricated threat, a legal fiction designed to force Elias into a protracted, expensive court battle that Merrick would inevitably win through bribery and influence. It was a punishment for harbouring Clara and a preemptive strike against whatever she might have found in the ledgers. Elias did not flinch. He stepped off the porch, closing the distance between himself and the buggy. His movements were slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly calm. He looked up at Merrick, his pale eyes burning with a cold blue fire. "You do not own the surveyor, Merrick, and you do not own me. If you or your men set foot on my southern pasture, you will not leave it. As for Mrs. Vance, she is under my protection. If you speak her name again in this town, I will come into Oakhaven and tear your bank down brick by brick to find the money you have stolen from me." Merrick's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. He was a coward who relied on paper and hired muscle, and the raw, physical promise of violence in Elias's voice made him shrink back against the leather seat. He signaled to his men, and the driver snapped the reins. "You will regret this, Thorne!" Merrick spat as the buggy turned around. "Both of you." They watched the buggy disappear over the ridge, leaving a trail of dust in the heavy air. Clara stepped up beside Elias. She could feel the tension radiating from him, a coiled spring ready to snap. "He knows I have seen the books," Clara said quietly. "He is terrified." "A terrified animal is a dangerous one," Elias replied, turning to look at her. "He will not stop at legal threats." The retaliation came 3 nights later. The dry thunderstorm that had threatened all week finally broke, but it brought no rain, only jagged forks of lightning that illuminated the valley in harsh, stroboscopic flashes, followed by the deafening crack of thunder. Clara was asleep in her small room when she was awakened by the smell. It was sharp, acrid, and unmistakable smoke. She threw off her quilt, pulled her heavy wool shawl over her nightgown, and rushed into the main cabin. The room was glowing with an unnatural, flickering orange light. She ran to the window and gasped. The massive timber barn, the structure that housed the horses, the winter feed, and the expensive farming implements was engulfed in flames. The fire had been deliberately set at the windward corner, and the dry wood was going up like a torch. "Elias!" Clara screamed, turning toward his door, but he was already there, pulling on his boots, his face a mask of grim determination. He grabbed a heavy canvas tarp and a bucket. "Stay here," he ordered, throwing open the cabin door and running toward the inferno. Clara ignored him. The ledgers, the proof of Merrick's crimes, were safe in the house, but the horses were in the barn. She grabbed 2 wooden buckets from the kitchen, filled them from the indoor water barrel, and ran out into the chaotic night. The heat was immense, a physical wall that pushed against her, singeing the loose hairs around her face. The roar of the fire was deafening, drowning out the thunder. Elias was at the heavy barn doors, fighting to haul them open against the draft of the blaze. Clara dropped her buckets and threw her weight against the wood, her hands burning against the hot iron handle. Together they forced the doors wide. The interior was a terrifying landscape of smoke and falling embers. The 4 horses in the stalls were screaming, kicking violently against the wood, mad with panic. Elias threw the soaked canvas tarp over his head and charged into the smoke, moving toward the stalls. Clara did not hesitate. She grabbed a soaked burlap sack from the watering trough outside, wrapped it around her face to filter the smoke, and followed him in. She could barely see, her eyes streaming with tears from the acrid smoke. She found Elias struggling to blindfold a massive black gelding. The horse was rearing, its hooves flashing dangerously close to Elias's head. Clara moved to the adjacent stall. She spoke in a low, firm voice, a tone she had used to calm her late husband during his fever deliriums. She slipped a rope halter over a trembling roan mare, draped a spare blanket over its eyes and pulled hard, leading the terrified animal out of the stall and toward the open doors. She ran the horse out into the corral, released it, and turned back toward the burning building. The roof was beginning to groan, the massive support beams cracking under the intense heat. She ran back inside, coughing violently, her lungs burning. She helped Elias guide the remaining 2 horses out, the heat blistering the skin on her forearms. Just as they cleared the doors with the final horse, a massive section of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and flaming debris, landing exactly where they had been standing seconds before. The concussive force knocked them both to the dusty ground of the yard. They lay there for a moment, gasping for air, watching the barn burn down to its foundation. There was nothing more to be done. The structure was lost, but the animals were safe. Elias pushed himself up to a sitting position, his face blackened with soot, his shirt torn and scorched. He looked over at Clara. She was sitting in the dirt, her nightgown ruined, her face smeared with ash, her hands raw and blistered. She was coughing, her chest heaving, but she was looking at the horses in the corral, counting them to ensure they were all there. Elias felt a profound, overwhelming surge of emotion, a breaking of the dam he had maintained for 5 years. He crawled over to her, his large, rough hands reaching out to gently take her blistered fingers. It was the first time they had touched. "You foolish, brave woman," Elias said, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual stoic reserve. "I told you to stay in the cabin. You could have been killed." Clara looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the dying flames. She did not pull her hands away. The warmth of his grip was grounding, an anchor in the chaotic night. "I am a partner in this ranch, Elias," she said, her voice raspy from the smoke. "I do not stand by while our livelihood burns." The word "our" hung in the smoky air between them. Elias looked down at her hands, his thumbs gently tracing the unburned skin of her wrists. "When my wife died," he began, his voice barely a whisper, the confession tearing out of him, "I was helpless. I could not fight the sickness. I could only watch. I swore I would never let myself care for something I could not protect again. I built a fortress here, but a fortress is just a prison from the inside." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "You opened the door, Clara. You saved the horses. You saved the ranch. You saved me." Clara felt a tear track a clean line through the soot on her cheek. "When Thomas died, I realized I had been living a life entirely dependent on the whims and failures of others. When I sat in the dust in Oakhaven, I promised myself I would never be helpless again. I found my strength here, Elias, in the work, in the quiet." She squeezed his hands. "In you." They sat there in the dirt, surrounded by the smell of smoke and ash, holding on to each other as the storm finally broke and a gentle, cleansing rain began to fall on the valley. It hissed against the embers of the barn, washing away the heat of the night. The next morning, the sky was a brilliant, washed blue. The ruins of the barn smouldered, but the air was clear. Elias and Clara washed the soot from their bodies, dressed in their finest, cleanest clothes, and hitched the wagon. Clara placed the heavy leather-bound ledger in a canvas bag, resting it carefully on her lap. They did not speak much on the ride into Oakhaven, but the silence was different now. It was charged with a unified purpose, a shared, unbreakable resolve. They were no longer 2 solitary survivors, they were a singular force. They arrived in Oakhaven just before noon. The town was busy, the boardwalks crowded with ranchers and merchants. Elias drove the wagon directly to the front of Silas Merrick's bank and mercantile, pulling the team to a halt with a sharp command. He stepped down, walked around, and offered his hand to Clara. She took it, stepping down with the canvas bag held firmly in her other hand. Together, they walked up the wooden steps and pushed open the heavy oak doors of the bank. Merrick was standing behind the teller's cage, speaking with the town sheriff, a man named Miller who usually turned a blind eye to Merrick's dealings. At the sight of Elias and Clara, Merrick's face drained of colour, then rapidly flushed red. He had expected them to be broken, perhaps even dead in the fire his men had set. He had not expected them to walk through his doors looking like avenging angels. "Thorn," Merrick blustered, attempting to regain his composure. "What is the meaning of this? You are interrupting my business." "I am concluding it, Merrick," Elias said, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet bank. He stepped aside, allowing Clara to move to the counter. Clara unbuckled the canvas bag and pulled out the heavy ledger. She opened it not to the front but to a page marked with a red ribbon. She turned the book so it faced Sheriff Miller, ignoring Merrick entirely. "Sheriff," Clara said, her voice clear, precise, and carrying the authority of absolute truth. "I am Clara Vance, bookkeeper for Blackwood Ridge. I have spent the last 4 weeks auditing Mr. Thorne's accounts. This ledger contains undeniable proof of systematic fraud, embezzlement, and forgery committed by Silas Merrick against Elias Thorne, and likely against half the ranchers in this valley." Merrick lunged forward, his fat hands reaching for the book. "That is a lie. She is a desperate widow, a thief herself." Elias moved with blinding speed. He grabbed Merrick's wrist, twisting it sharply until the banker gasped in pain and fell back against the counter. "Touch her, or that book, and I will break your arm," Elias said quietly. Sheriff Miller, sensing the shift in power, stepped forward and looked down at the ledger. Clara pointed to the columns. "Note the discrepancies between the drover's receipts, which I have copied here, and the bank deposits. Note the fabricated transit fees. It amounts to over $3,000 stolen from Mr. Thorne alone. If you audit the accounts of the other ranches, I guarantee you will find the same pattern." The bank had gone dead silent. The few patrons inside were staring, wide-eyed. The sheriff looked from the meticulous numbers to Merrick's sweating, panic-stricken face. The evidence was undeniable. The neat, precise columns of ink were a noose woven by Clara's own hand. "Merrick," Sheriff Miller said slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, "you'd best step out from behind that cage. We need to have a long talk at the jailhouse, and I'll be needing the keys to the vault to secure these records." Merrick seemed to deflate, the bluster leaving him in a rush. He was a man who ruled by illusion, and Clara had just shattered the mirror. As the sheriff led a defeated, trembling Silas Merrick out the front doors, a murmur swept through the gathered crowd outside. The reign of the predator was over, broken by a quiet rancher and a widow who refused to be a victim. Elias and Clara walked out of the bank into the bright midday sun. The townspeople, who had shunned Clara weeks before, now parted respectfully to let them pass. Martha Higgins, the boarding-house owner, offered Clara a small, apologetic nod, which Clara returned with quiet grace. They reached the wagon, but before Elias helped her up, he stopped and turned to face her. The street was bustling, but they existed in a private pocket of silence. Elias reached out and gently took her hands, his thumbs grazing the bandages she had wrapped around her burns that morning. He looked down at her, his pale eyes entirely open, completely stripped of their defences. He did not offer poetry or grand, dramatic declarations. He offered the only thing he truly valued: his life, his land, and his unwavering respect. "The arrangement we made," Elias said, his voice steady and deep, "was for a bookkeeper and a housekeeper. You have fulfilled those duties and far exceeded them. You saved my ranch, Clara. You saved me from my own isolation." He paused, swallowing hard. "I do not want an employee anymore. I want a partner. I want you to stay at Blackwood Ridge, not as a housekeeper, but as a wife. We will build a new barn. We will build a new life. Together." Clara looked up at the tall, weathered man who had offered her a lifeline when the world had offered only dust. She saw the absolute sincerity in his eyes, the profound, quiet love that had grown from mutual respect and shared hardship. She did not need flowery words. She needed this solid, unyielding truth. "I would be honored to be your wife, Elias," Clara said, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face, softening the severe lines of her practical demeanor. "But I will continue to keep the ledgers. You are terrible at mathematics." Elias laughed, a deep, resonant sound that surprised him as much as it surprised the townspeople watching them. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said, lifting her into the wagon. 8 months later, the spring thaw had come to Blackwood Ridge, turning the valley into a brilliant emerald expanse. The scars of the fire were gone, replaced by a massive new barn built of fresh golden pine that smelled of sap and sawdust. The ranch was thriving, Silas Merrick was serving a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary, and the funds he had stolen had been returned, allowing Elias and Clara to expand their herd and purchase new equipment. The town of Oakhaven had changed too, freed from the suffocating grip of the corrupt banker, and Clara was now highly respected, often consulted by other ranchers to review their own tangled accounts. The sun was setting, casting long, golden rays across the porch of the log cabin. Clara sat in a rocking chair, a woven blanket draped over her lap, a ledger resting closed on the small table beside her. She watched Elias walk up from the new corral, dusting his canvas coat, the setting sun catching the silver at his temples. He climbed the porch steps and sat heavily in the chair beside hers, letting out a long, contented sigh. He reached over, his large, calloused hand covering hers. They did not speak, they simply sat together, listening to the soft rustle of the wind through the pines and the distant nickering of the horses. They watched the sky turn from gold to deep violet, entirely at peace in the world they had fought for, the world they had built together from the ashes of their pasts. It was a quiet, enduring prosperity, anchored by a partnership forged in the crucible of the frontier, a testament to the resilience of two souls who had finally found their way home.